Hello, men. Welcome to this Exodus conversation. Today, we are speaking with Marty O'Donnell, who is a famous composer, known most for his soundtracks of the Halo video game series. But he's also a Catholic convert and is running for Congress. So we have so many wonderful things to talk with him about. My name is Dr. Jared Staudt, the director of content for Exodus. And we will begin, as we always do, with our prayer to Saint Joseph. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O glorious Saint Joseph, model of all those who are devoted to labor, obtain for me the grace to work conscientiously, putting the call of duty above my natural inclinations, to work with gratitude and joy and a spirit of penance for the remission of my sins, considering it an honor to employ and develop by means of labor the gifts received from God, to work with order, peace, moderation, and patience without ever shrinking from weariness and difficulties, to work above all with purity of intention and detachment from self, having always death before my eyes and the account that I must render of time lost, of talents wasted, of good omitted, of vain complacency and success so fatal to the work of God. All for Jesus, all through Mary, all after thine example, O Patriarch Saint Joseph. Such shall be my motto in life and in death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So without further ado, I will welcome Marty on here for our conversation. Welcome.
Jared, thanks so much for having me here. This is a total pleasure. And that prayer is an amazing prayer. I'm going to have to get a copy of that.
Yeah,
I
it
don't
was
know that
written by
one.
Saint Pius X. So you have one saint writing a prayer to another saint.
Oh,
It's really
it's an
great.
amazing prayer. Yeah, I loved it.
So, I bet you've had this experience a bunch of times when you're telling people what you do. Yeah, I'm a composer. And they're like, oh, yeah, interesting. What do you compose music for? And you're like, oh, Halo. And they're like, really? And then they probably know your music, right? If they're playing the video game.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. The first half of my career, I composed for TV commercials and film scores. So I did commercials like "We are Flintstones kids, 10 million strong and growing." As a matter of fact,
Is
I
that
wrote that.
yours?
Yeah, that's
You wrote
mine.
that?
I wrote that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, my mom used to give me those pills and I would hear the music. I said, all right, take your Flintstones.
There you go. That's exactly what we intended to happen for you, and I'm glad you grew up. That's exactly what was intended.
Well, not very much though, dude. I'm like 5'6", so I
Oh,
wish I had
okay.
grown up, but
You should have doubled your Flintstones vitamins.
I guess so.
Um, yeah, actually, my daughter is the little girl at the end who sang "And Growing." So,
That's
uh,
incredible. Yeah.
yeah, and she is amazing. She's no longer 5 years old. Trust me, she's had a wonderful career, and she's still going strong with a nonprofit here in Las Vegas. So we can talk about that a little bit too. But yeah,
Sure.
I did commercials and film scores, and then I switched over to games. So at first, people knew me for the Flintstones Vitamins jingle,
Yeah, I've
and
never played Halo. I'm like, "Oh, Flintstones. All right. Now we're talking."
well, one of the two should hit. That's
Yeah.
what's fun for me. So then I did Halo in the first music we did was in 1999 for Halo, and I had been doing games for a couple of years of scores for video games by that point, and it was announced at Macworld in 1999 with Steve Jobs, and the music played, and it made sort of a big kind of a impact, and eventually Microsoft, like the next year, decided to buy Bungie, the company I was with at the time. And so yeah, that was, we went ahead and finished the game, released it in 2001, and now people know me for Halo. Although there's another group of people a little bit younger even who know me for the score to Destiny, which is the 10 years after we shipped Halo. We shipped 5 different Halo products, and then we started working on Destiny, which shipped in 2014. So that's 10 years ago now. So the score to Destiny, some younger people know that for me for that. So I've had a nice career composing music. Let me just say that.
Well, and where did you grow up? Where are you from originally?
Well, let's see. I was born in Pennsylvania, and I moved to California when I was a little kid. My dad was a filmmaker, and believe it or not, he worked for Moody Bible's films. He did films out there when I was a little kid. I remember watching him on the set. Then we moved to Chicago, and I pretty much grew up in Chicago. Went to school there. Went to Wheaton College Conservatory of Music. Um, then I got my master's degree at USC. So we lived in California for a couple of years, where my daughter was born. Um, and then we moved back to Chicago. So we were there for a long time, right up until 2000. And then we moved to Seattle, lived in Seattle working for Microsoft, and then working for an independent studio, Bungie, which became independent. And then I started my own company there with a couple friends. And then 3 years ago, sort of decided maybe I'll experiment with retirement, move to Las Vegas where my grandchildren are. Thought I would just sort of retire here, um, spend more time with my family, which I've done. I think my family's kind of ready for me to do something again. It's like, okay, enough time. I probably, experimenting with retirement a little bit too young, and I have, more energy than I couldn't figure out what to do with my time. Although I have my nice little studio here, as you can see in the background,
Yeah.
over here, yeah, um, where I do some composition and production. Um, but yeah, I got drawn into now. I'm doing a third thing in my life. First, commercials, TV commercials, then video game scores, and now I'm running for Congress. So it's a it's a I told somebody the other day, because I'm a game person. I love playing games. I kind of feel like I already finished the main quest. So I finished and won the main quest, and now I'm going back and doing a side quest. So I think running
That's
for
awesome.
Congress is sort of a side quest for me.
And we're gonna have a few conversations, and so I think we're gonna have one that just focuses in on that because I wanna ask you a lot about it, but I'm gonna hold off for now. Well, if your dad was working with Moody, then I'm assuming you grew up in a very strong household of faith.
Yes, I did. My mom and dad. My dad had a wonderful conversion story before I was born. He had been an alcoholic. He was unkind to my mother, um, and she came back to the faith, and took him to in 19 believe it or not, I think it's like 1952, so it's a long time ago, but took him to a, Billy Graham revival thing, with those big revival meetings that Billy Graham had, and it was a life-changing experience. He gave his life to Christ that night. Um, I think he even got to, believe it or not, this is what at the time when it was possible for you to talk to Billy Graham at afterwards if you came forward. And his whole life turned around. He just dedicated his life to the Lord, and by the time I came around in 1955, I had two very strong Christian parents who, raised me right. Let me just say that.
Praise God.
Yeah.
And so if he was, kinda working in film, which has a connection to the arts, did he really then encourage you to pursue music? Where did that aspiration come from?
Well, my mother was a pianist, and she
Mm.
also taught piano lessons. So, but we had a piano from the very beginning. I still remember, probably 3 or 4 years old, walking through the living room, and then, reaching above my head, and that was the piano keys, and I just couldn't not touch the piano when I walked by. So she got me lessons. Um, she taught me from the time I was 4, but very relaxed, no pressure. And then she decided, when I was 7, that I was serious enough about it. I kept playing the piano and doing things, and she wanted me to have a real teacher, that wasn't my parent. It's
Right.
always a problem when you're trying to teach your own kids. Trust me, I know this. It doesn't work. Um, yeah, so I started piano lessons at 7, and, became a piano major by the time I was 18 at the conservatory, so I was very serious about it.
And if you went to Wheaton, then I'm assuming that, there was a connection between faith and your music.
Well, that's interesting. That's a very, That's a complex question. Um, my faith was always strong, but I was never very interested in, I guess what you would call Christian music. I wasn't, I didn't study hymnody. I didn't also take organ and play in the church. I was I was more of a rock and roll guy. So I was
Mm,
rock and roll, jazz, progressive rock. I was very interested in things, and I don't think, I did read C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton from a very early age, Tolkien. I still remember Lewis talking about we don't need more Christian books. We need more books by Christian authors.
mm,
And that's the way I've always felt that way about music. We don't need more quote unquote music cannot be Christian. Only human souls can be saved to become Christian. So,
mm.
as a human soul, as a composer, my faith is everything. And then it's going to somehow, I hope and pray, be reflected in the music I write. But until recently, I'd never really thought about doing something explicitly, um, yeah, how do I put this? Liturgical, I guess. Yeah.
Right. And you weren't Catholic, right? I think that makes
Right.
more sense for a Catholic to think in terms of liturgical music.
Possibly. Although, I mean, um, this is funny. I'm assuming that you grew up Catholic. Are you a cradle
I grew up
Catholic?
as a non-practicing Catholic, and I had a big
Okay.
conversion at the ripe age of 13.
Oh, spectacular. Okay. Um, when I'm jumping forward a little bit here, but like going through RCIA just a couple years ago, I I was funny because I sort of feel like I was the token Protestant in the room, and um, when I would the difference between me and a lot of the people who were in the room, uh, number one very noticeable thing was when the teacher would uh, give a reference from the Bible, I would just open right up to it because that's one of the things Protestants do. We
Yeah.
carry our
What are
Bibles
you
around,
doing? I've never seen anybody do that before. You're actually opening the Bible.
and like people would look at me like, "How do you know where this is?" And I'm like, I took sword drills." And they're like, "What are sword drills?" And it's one of those things. If you grow up Protestant in certain kinds of Protestant churches, um, in the Sunday school, you will. It's like a competition. First kid to open to Ezekiel 12:1, wins some prize, right? So, anyway, you just sort of learn that, and I also did some Bible quizzing, which I'm not sure if you've even heard of that. Is that
Well,
something you've heard of?
actually, so my wife who grew up in a devout Catholic family in Minnesota,
Yeah.
they did Bible quizzing, and it was Christian Missionary Alliance, and they were like,
Oh, there you go.
"Can we accept a Catholic teen into Bible quizzing?" And they're like, "Is there a rule against that? Anyone? Can you
It
find it?" And they're
shouldn't
like,
be.
"Well, I guess you can join," you know?
Yeah. I'm glad I hope that we're past that point. This is what I felt like we got to the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed that we were looking at, and I'm like, "Well, hey, that's the same creeds I grew up with, like, those are the exact same words." And they're like, "Really? Exact same words?" I'm like, "Yeah, we even say Catholic Church in our creed. The
Yeah,
Protestants we all say the same thing. We're all Christian." Um so it's funny when you say convert to the Catholic Church. I don't feel like I converted as much as I decided to come home to the Catholic Church. I
yeah.
was converted to Christianity, at some point when I was 7 years old with my mother sitting by me opening the Bible and answering my questions, and I prayed. I feel like I became a Christian then, and then I've had a journey right through life, ups and downs, back and forths. But yeah, I feel definitely now at home in the Catholic Church. But like I still I still have, of course, a ton of Protestant friends, and I have my issues with leadership in the Protestant Church and leadership in the Catholic Church, and
It's like human beings on both sides or
can
something,
you
you know?
believe it?
Yeah.
Like fallen human beings, just like the Bible says. So,
Yeah. One of the
yeah,
12 fell away, you know?
exactly.
It's part of it. And I've heard so many people say it, and I think you articulated it so well, that in becoming Catholic, you're not leaving things behind.
Right.
but you're gaining more, right?
Yeah.
And that is the right way to think about
Well,
it.
I think G.K. Chesterton, who's always been one of my favorite authors, of course, and Tolkien too, and being a C.S. Lewis fan, um, it's funny because I know Tolkien and Lewis would discuss Lewis coming, to the Catholic faith, and frankly, Lewis died at age 64, and I was still a Protestant at age 64, and I came to the Catholic Church, like 2 years later at 66. I feel like Lewis, this is me projecting and being kinda ridiculous, but I think he was coming around. I think he was gonna come to the Catholic faith eventually, um, because he was high Anglican, and the differences are like, especially to an American Protestant, I can't tell the differences. I mean, you have to look deep into
Yeah.
to some of the liturgy
And
and,
Chesterton sat there for a long time.
yes. Yeah, and
So
Chesterton is the same, that's one thing that, I think it's in his book, Orthodoxy, where he describes, going out the back door, walking all the way around the world, and coming back in the front door, and
yeah.
that's his journey back to the Catholic faith and the Christian church, and that's a little bit the way I feel, happened for me, and so, yeah.
Well, we'll have to unpack that more, but, when you talked about Tolkien, I think he's a great model of how you described your approach to music, because he was a very devout Catholic, but you open up The Lord of the Rings, and it's not like Our Lady and the Eucharist are jumping off the page, but
Right,
it's there because it's part of the way that he just thinks.
right.
It infused his sensibilities, and
Yeah,
he called The Lord of the Rings, a deeply Catholic work, but it's
yeah,
implicit.
yeah. Yes, and I think one of my favorite I'm actually depending a lot on Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis, uh, because I learned so much reading both of their works and their friendship and as artists and scholars, like, they were tremendous people. One of the things Lewis did was he wrote a fantastic apologetic, which was based on a series of his radio shows called Mere Christianity. I'm sure you've heard of it or read it.
And taught it, and yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Really? Can a Catholic teach Mere Christianity, from C.S. Lewis?
It's interesting because I did that at the University of Mary, a Catholic college, because I just said, I need to get freshmen to mere Christianity before I can teach them the catechism, right? It's just like, I just need to help them to think about the basics here.
Right, right, and, one of his images that he has in there is coming into a house, he's bringing you in that front door, and you're in the hallway, and it's a beautiful hallway, but at some point, you're gonna have to choose which room you wanna go into. Um, and so, yeah, he opened the Anglican door and went in deep there. I, was non-denominational Protestant and then Swedish Covenant, and then eventually, experimented with Episcopal, and then
Mhm.
came what I consider to be finally opening the door down the hall that's the Catholic Church, and I'm very happy to have done that. Another I have my own analogy for this. I hope this isn't sacrilegious in some way, but I feel like as an American, I'm a baseball fan. I love baseball. I love the game of baseball, but you're not really a baseball fan until you're a fan of a team. Like, so I'm a Cubs fan. I will always be a Cubs fan. It's sort of a horrible burden
Is
to
that the
have.
sacrilegious part or no? Yeah.
Probably to many people it is, yes. But what I'm saying is that, you can you can be a Christian, you can be a baseball fan, but until you actually are in a denomination, in a church, chosen, the fan, you're going to be a fan of this church. You've chosen to be in this church. That's when the depth of Christianity, I think, opens up,
Mm.
even, more broadly and deeper for a person. So that's
I
like you can be a fan of baseball, but you're not really a serious fan until you've chosen a team and, you know, think
And why
they're the
not have a
best.
team with 2,000 years of pedigree there, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
George Weigel and others, have liked to say this, that they find baseball to be very liturgical.
Oh,
Because,
interesting.
you know,
Oh,
there's no clock, right?
yeah,
And
that's right.
and it's just you're just there experiencing it, and they give all kinds of reasons. I can't say that I'm quite there yet, but, you know, they're very convinced, you know? Yeah. Um, Now, if you so you were big in rock and roll, and then you went to Wheaton College, and I'm even trying to put that together in my mind, right? Because you know, you have a fundamentalist, you know, like a Protestant school, right? Or is it Calvinist, when you go to Wheaton, or
No, it's not Calvinist.
no?
It's I would say relatively non-denominational. It's
Okay.
evangelical. It's the school Billy Graham went to, and it's the school that attracts a lot of different Protestant denominations. And I think there are some Catholics there too. I remember
Mhm.
meeting a couple.
Do
But
they have
it
to
is
hide? Because and maybe it's on the faculty side. I think I've heard of faculty members having to resign when if they became Catholic, but that's probably maybe it's not a strict requirement for the students like it is for the faculty there.
that's an interesting. I should look into that. I was actually on the board of visitors a few years ago, 10 years ago. I don't think I ever heard of that rule. It might
Mm.
be a legacy. It might be an old rule where if a faculty becomes Catholic, they resign. That doesn't sound right to me. I feel like I wouldn't be surprised if they've loosened that up and that's no longer a thing. I would hope so. I would pray that it's no longer a thing. That makes no sense to me.
Well, yeah, don't quote me on that, but I think I know a couple of guys who went through that, but I could be mixing up colleges as well. But,
Could be, yes.
so
I'll have to look.
if you were there and like you said, you weren't getting into liturgical music, were you still immersed in classical music at that point? Are there certain classical composers that influenced you?
Well, there's a lot of classical composers that influenced me. The interesting thing about Wheaton College Conservatory was it was still very, you know, at the time, 20th century, it was especially in the music composition department, which I switched out of. I started as a piano major, and then, um, in the second quarter of my junior year, so kind of late, I decided to change majors to music composition, which was dangerous. I was potentially not going to be able to graduate on time because I had to like make up all sorts of classes. But I didn't care because, like I told the dean of the conservatory, I said, "Oh, that's okay. I don't really need a degree anyway. I'm going to be a rock star." So but I did make it. I made it and went to graduate school after that. So I did finish all my composition stuff. I got off on a tangent. You asked me something specific. I'm trying to remember what it was.
Yeah, the composers that you know, if you've been
Oh,
influenced
yeah,
by
yeah, yeah.
particular classical composers, yeah.
So what I was going to say is that the composers I was most influenced by uh, were, taught at the conservatory, but they were also pushing some very contemporary composition techniques and composers, which I didn't necessarily like all that much. I was more of
Mm,
a traditional tonality person. So you might think of Wheaton College Conservatory as being conservative in terms of no rock and roll and no atonal music or something. They were very progressive in a lot of
mm,
ways artistically. You could learn all sorts of things. But I was a big fan of the classics, right? Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, without a doubt. For 20th century, I still prefer the more tonal music. I still think of Stravinsky and Bartok as tonal. They have pitch centers, which are always important in all their pieces. So I love Stravinsky and Bartok, and I've Samuel Barber and Ralph Vaughan Williams and Benjamin Britten, just all sorts of these composers who I've loved and love their stuff. So
and
and
do you
then
find
contemporary, you know, uh, like John Rutter, who's a choral guy who just does absolutely beautiful stuff. Yeah. Anyway, there's so many. I don't know where to begin on that.
yourself going back to certain ones, you know, for inspiration?
Um, wow, that's interesting. I tend to be leery of immersing myself the same way I did maybe when I was much younger.
Mm,
And the reason is I I think I can get too influenced by what I'm hearing, if that makes sense. So for
And so you
me
just
to
wanna, like, parrot it if you're listening to it too much.
yeah, so I don't listen to music for inspiration. That's,
Mm,
I guess, the thing. I don't
wow.
listen to music to be inspired to write music. Um, I don't know how other composers feel about that. That's an interesting thought. I feel that enough of the, left side, right side of my whole brain has been trained to analyze and understand music. I can still really love music that I'm listening to, but I don't go there to be inspired.
Well, I'm assuming
That
at a
makes
certain
sense.
point, right, you have to form a certain base knowledge, right? So you're studying those composers in school,
Yeah.
you're learning compositional techniques, but then it's there, and I guess you're saying you don't need to necessarily go back, but I'm assuming at a certain point, it had to influence you at the
Oh,
beginning.
absolutely.
Yeah,
No, I can hear there's, all sorts of influence in my music. I'm not saying my music is unique. I'm saying that
yeah,
I'm afraid of listening to too much of one composer, and then that
right.
I will start mimicking in some, way that I don't intend. But yeah, my influences stem from the classical composers, film composers, even TV composers, and for example, Michael Kamen did the score to Band of Brothers. It's just one of my favorite TV scores ever written. It's just beautiful, um, and I can hear that and just relax into how emotionally evocative and perfect that score is. So I appreciate that a lot. And then, of course, I have this whole rock, progressive rock, fusion, jazz fusion influence. It's all mixed together in there somehow. So,
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about that, right? 'Cause I'm pretty big in classical music, so I led there, but tell me about the other influence and how that does mix.
well, you remember the band Gentle Giant, right?
No, I
Of
don't.
course. Well, Gentle Giant, there was a progressive rock movement that started probably in 1969, uh, with bands like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and King Crimson. And there was another band and Genesis. There was another band called Gentle Giant that started around that same period. I just fell in love with all of that music because I think it it played to my classical music sensibilities. It was thoughtful music. It was composed. It was, you had to be somewhat virtuoso on your instrument.
Mhm.
Um, it wasn't just, three chords, bang the drum and out. It was actually, and it was very influenced, I think, by the later Beatles. Because the Beatles opened up in their, mid to late period with music that was much more interesting as music than just the pop music at the time. And I think that sort of gave permission to some of these rock bands to explore and do really interesting things compositionally. And Gentle Giant is the most interesting. Period. That's it. That's the end.
Well, I'm gonna look it up now. I mean, I'm
Gentle
ignorant.
Giant is a super interesting group. I happen to be just, a huge fan of what they did, and it probably has to do with the age I was when I first heard them. But they were contrapuntal. They heavily into counterpoint, which was I just hadn't heard that any other place. And by the time I got to my first 16th century counterpoint class at the conservatory, I realized, "Oh, that's what those guys are doing. Oh, this is
Palestrina.
fascinating."
Yeah,
Yeah, yes, exactly.
yeah,
No, and, I just that was probably one of the classes that I got the most out of. It opened my mind up to, um, not thinking homophony, chord and
yeah,
melody, baseline
yeah,
chord melody. Um, it's not it's not driven by harmonic progressions as much as, melodic, forward movement and melodies stacked on top of each other. And so each voice needs to be a melody that can stand on its own. And that idea is I love that idea. So
So do I. That is great. I wasn't expecting that. That is an awesome connection.
Oh, yeah.
And so did that provide a model for you then? I mean, even as you're eventually composing music for video games, is that still there in the back of your mind
Oh,
as a
yeah,
model?
that's actually probably I've tried to explain to people how that never goes away from me, but even as a pianist, a lot of times, and I know guitar players too, they think in terms of chord progressions, their hands just fall into chords and chord progressions. Pianists, we have 10 fingers, so we feel like we have to always play all 10, notes at the same time. And that if you start thinking as a composer contrapuntally, that's not that's not a way to think. That's one approach. It's not the only approach. So even when I start something from a chord melody kind of beginning, I'll always look for how can I make my inner voices actually better? How can I actually bring counterpoint into this? And then discover the kind of harmonies that grow out of that, rather than just typical predictable kind of progressions. And so, yeah, that's always behind almost everything I write.
Mm, that's awesome. And so you go to USC. I'm assuming that's a pretty good place to make Hollywood connections. And, from grad school, you got into TV commercials, but was it location, really being crucial there and making those
That's
relationships?
interesting. Well, one of the first things when I went to USC, I was at the year I was accepted for the grad school for a master's program. One of the first things they said was, don't think you're gonna be making connections with Hollywood people, they frowned on this whole idea of, like, "Oh, people are coming to USC because they wanna get into the movie business." And so I was like, "Oh, okay, I guess I'm not gonna do that." But there was a man there who taught named David Raxon, and he wasn't officially part of the music school. He was sort of teaching, almost adjunct, I guess, but he was teaching film composing. I think as part of the film school, and it was almost like in the grad school, they didn't wanna, like I think the credits I got for taking that class didn't count towards my degree, so,
But it
uh
seems like it was useful in the end, but,
oh,
yeah.
very, very useful, and he was he's one of the godfathers of the film music industry. He
Wow.
knew everybody, he had done everything, he had won Academy Awards. The first film he worked on was Modern Times with Charlie Chaplin.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
yes, when he was a young man, he was brought in because Charlie was an incredibly talented person who knew what music he wanted and could write music by singing melodies and then telling somebody, "No, do this instead and do this, and now add this." But he couldn't read music. So David was there as a young man to essentially transcribe and assist Charlie Chaplin in scoring this film, Modern Times, which was 1935. It was one of the first movies that Charlie did that had sound in it, and it was an amazing score. Uh, but he went all the way up. He scored the movie Laura, which is a famous film noir um, film. Won Academy Awards, became a huge pop song. Um, beautiful melody. He was just such an incredible composer, but by the time I got him, he was sort of this old irascible guy, like, the way they do it today is not the way we used to do it. And of course, he was probably only like 65 or something, but to me, he was this old guy, and now I'm the old guy. But I just love taking classes with him, and then I loved the other stuff I learned at USC. So, I feel like I've had a very good education.
And so how did you then get into writing music for commercials?
Yeah, so I went back to Chicago and, had a new baby. This is 1982, and I just needed to find a job. I thought I was gonna teach, at the American Conservatory of Music in Chicago. I had interviewed with them, and they were very positive, and I thought, "Well, this is it. I'm gonna be a teacher and a college professor, and I'm ready to go." But in the meantime, that summer, I needed to make some money to keep food on the table, so I became a grip on film sets, 'cause I grew up that way, my dad being a film director. Um, So anyway, I was on the set one day of this film that we were working on, a little tiny nothing film. And a grip is someone who runs cable and sets lights, and it's not as hard today to do this because of the technology. But back then, the lights were heavy and the cables were thick, and the lights were hot too, by the way. But anyway, the producer came up to me, and it was a woman, and she said, "Hey, Marty, you've got a master's in music composition. Why don't you write music for, film and commercials here in Chicago?" And I said, "Well, because I don't want to prostitute my art." So yes, you laugh, and I should have laughed too. But I was young and full of myself and really thought that's what was happening until, and this is the absolute truth. The very next day on the same set, the director came to me, and his name was Bo May. I'll never forget it. He came up to me and he goes, "Hey, Marty, I'll give you $500 if you score this film." I don't know why he thought I could even do that, but he knew I had, music thing, and he had $500. And I'm like, "Yes." So
See,
apparently I
cold
just
hard cash won out in the end, right?
yeah, well, yeah, and it turns out I didn't know my price. That's the only thing. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so
$500, right? I mean,
500
when you're out of grad school, you're like, "Oh, great, I can buy some food," right?
yeah, 1982, that was a lot. Of course, I had no equipment. I had no way of doing anything. But my longtime friend, Mike Salvatori, had a recording studio in his house in the suburbs. And I called him up and said, "Hey, Mike, let me come over, and whatever equipment you have there, I need to record stuff to show a demo to this director, and I'll split $500 with you." So now my price is down to $250. Uh, and Mike was excited about it, and that began a partnership. Mike and I worked together that night, and it did like what we called our 5-song demo. We made up 5 tunes, 5 production things, very funky, cool, electronic, because that's the equipment we had in the studio, and played it for the director. And he was like, "This is perfect. You go, I'm going to give you the film to do." And there was another client in the film studio at that point, and he heard this music, and he says, "This is what we've been looking for," and immediately took it to Marshall Fields, the advertising agency for Marshall Fields, which was a big department store in Chicago. And they picked it up, and this is like on a Thursday. On Sunday afternoon, I'm watching the Bears football game. Up comes the Marshall Fields commercial with our music, no voiceover, just music and beautiful visuals. And I'm
Wow.
like, "This is easy. I'm gonna do this." It was so much fun. We got such a jump start. And it was like, okay, well, this is obviously what we need to do. Of course, it didn't stay that easy, but it was a great way to begin. Probably if we had failed at first, I might have just, you know, moved on into something else. I don't know, but it was a blast. That's how we started.
Well, I laughed so hard when you said that because, of course, I was a college professor at various schools, and then I started working, for a diocese, and now I'm with an app. So I suppose a theologian going to work for a Catholic men's app is like a musician going to work for video games or something, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know what? Here's the thing. I feel like sometimes our education can make it seem as though making a living doing something is somehow lesser than, especially as an artist. Like, artists shouldn't care about money, and I've it's just that's insane. Like, God's given us work to do, and fruits of our labors, and starving artists. There's nothing wonderful about a starving artist. It's like, uh, that doesn't mean your art is any good. Just
Makes
as a
for
matter of
good
fact,
libretto or something,
yeah,
though, right? Yeah,
if you're
Puccini,
starving, your art might need some help, right? I
yeah.
mean, if nobody wants to buy your stuff, that's could be an indicator, that's all. I'm not saying it's a for sure thing.
I'm a
Um
martyr for my bad art, Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Just think how horrible that would be if you found out, like, you martyred yourself for something that was not worthwhile at all. So, it's sort of like when people talk about Christian ministry, like, "Are you in the ministry?" And I'm like, "Well, we're all priests, we're all ministers, our vocation is, if you're called to the priesthood, that's a very, very special thing, and I totally understand that. Or you're called to be a pastor, I understand, but we're all called, whatever our vocation is, to be salt and light and to reflect Jesus Christ. So um, it's that same thing again, where um, in the art side of things, this idea that you have to never commercialize your work. Um, Maybe you just don't need to, as long as your work has integrity. Um, then I think it doesn't matter whether you are making a lot of money on it or a little money on it or whatever. It's not the amount of money, but somehow making money doesn't uh, invalidate the artistic work you're doing. And I mean, all you have to
Michelangelo
do is,
did pretty well for himself, you know?
would you say?
Michelangelo did pretty well for himself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, that's all of our examples from, the artists who were commissioned by the Pope, to Bach, who was a church musician his entire life and just did spectacularly wonderful things. Beethoven, Mozart, everybody. Now, if they might have been debauched and not spent their money well, but there was nothing that it didn't minimize the effect of their music because they were making a living at it. So
Yeah.
I was going to go back to the C.S. Lewis Mere Christianity thing. Um, because one of the things I love about when he realized at one point in his life that you can't argue people into the kingdom. That's not the only way to get people to open up their minds to the kingdom of God, of the kingdom of Christ. And so he decided late in his life to actually do the Chronicles of Narnia. So I look at the Chronicles of Narnia as sort of the fictional storytelling, almost parable like version of Mere Christianity. And
Mhm.
we look at Jesus Christ, and he taught his disciples and us using stories and parables constantly. So he didn't argue people into his side of things. He told stories, he told parables. Um, and I think it's the same way with creativity and artists. Our job is to like be compelling, compel people with our art to come in. Um, and if, as long as we have integrity, if we're doing it for the buck, then it's prostitution. If we're doing it with integrity and happen to get paid, there's nothing wrong with that. That's
Yeah, that's
that's
right.
a good thing.
I wanna skip over, your time writing music for video games because I really wanna lean into that in our next conversation.
Sure.
So I wanna finish what we were talking about earlier, and I think bringing up Mere Christianity again is a good segue into this. What did, lead to, I don't wanna say your conversion, but your coming into the Catholic Church, coming into the fullness, coming home?
Well, a couple of things. Of course, my wife is very influential in this, but before before I blame my wife for this, for years we worked together. My wife has got her master's in choral conducting, so she's a songwriter. She's an amazing pianist. She's a great musician. We met, of course, at the college conservatory, Wheaton College Conservatory. Um, Raised the kids, two daughters, and but after she had a couple of church jobs as the choir director at a couple of different churches. Um, we I think we both started getting a little bit, wait, what's going on in this church? Like, why
Mm,
is this church no longer standing for the doctrines and the foundational principles, and like, why is our church starting to get too influenced by politics and starting to loosen up on things that we don't think it should loosen up on? So we moved to Seattle. You know After we left the church job, after she left the church job she had, we started drifting around to different churches and being very dissatisfied, especially with the influence of culture on church and doctrine, especially starting to see doctrinal things cave in. Uh, she was first. I was just like, well, I don't need to go to church anymore. I've had it. and, and she couldn't stand doing that. So, about 10 years ago, she started going to a Catholic church. and then she decided to do the RCIA. And the first RCI didn't take, like, something,
Mm.
she wasn't like, I'm not sure I'm convinced yet. She went back and did it again, and then there she was. She's joining the Catholic Church, and I'm sitting there with her, and I'm like, well, this is fine. I'll I'll go to church with her. And it started to bug me that I wasn't going to church with her and, you know, being able to take the Eucharist and participate in communion, sitting there with my wife and not being, unified in our ability to take communion. So when we moved to Las Vegas 3 years ago, I decided I would, whatever the local parish is that we're, going to, we started going there, and signed up for RCIA to see what it was all about. And, you know, like we said before, there are human beings involved every place, fallen human beings every place. I'm a fallen human being. Um, but I want to know that the doctrine and what I believe isn't going to change. And that's probably one of the best things. I hope this doesn't sound too surfacey, but I think one of the best things about the Catholic Church is it doesn't change. It changes in a lot of kind of weird surface ways that are not important, but the
Right.
doctrine will not change. And that's something that it's, upon this rock, I will build my church. I've always, as a Protestant, we tend to emphasize the symbol of what Peter said to Christ being the foundational rock that the church is built on. But and the Catholic Church tends to act more like the most important thing was that Peter is the rock upon which the church is built. And I think it's both. I think Peter was the right man at the right time, saying the right thing. So the church is built on Peter and the doctrinal statement that he said. And that's Christ's church is built on that. And that hasn't changed.
Amen.
Like you said, in
Mm.
2000 years, that hasn't changed. And it's like, I'm seeing all these other Protestant churches. What happens in the Protestant church, as you know, is once Martin Luther said, well, I guess we can start our own thing. And I think Martin Luther and the Lutherans should have been like the Franciscans. It should have just been another part of the Catholic Church. It's a tragedy, in my opinion, that it became its own thing. It should have just been like, what do you call those? What are the
Like a
Franciscans?
movement,
A
an
movement, an
order, a
order. Yeah.
movement, or yeah, something like that.
And I just wish we had been able, me and like millions of other people wish that the Christian church could have stayed unified and just had some different orders and different viewpoints, because there's very little from a doctrinal standpoint, in my opinion, that is difference between the two. The core of Christianity remains the same.
The
So
Nicene Creed, like you said, that unites
yeah,
us still.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So anyway, but I just feel like maybe it's my age, maybe it's I just don't want to argue about things anymore. The answer isn't to be in a Protestant church and then say, oh, half the church wants to do this new thing and change the doctrine, so we're going to split. When that happens all the time, once the permission to split was given or was taken, I should say that action was taken to split, uh, then all you have is thousands of splits. They just keep happening. So that's very practical reason why I've come back to the Catholic Church, because we're not going to split. It's we're back to foundational principles and fundamental doctrines that I agree with, and the answer is not to take my ball and go home and start my own church, right? And
Yeah.
that happens constantly in the Protestant church. And
Well,
to a
and it
certain extent, you can see I can still see controversy in the Catholic Church,
right.
coming from the very top sometimes. But the foundational doctrines don't change, and that's
That's right.
very reassuring to me.
There's always going to be human tensions in the church.
Yes.
Paul and Barnabas, duking it out, it's all the way back to the beginning.
Yeah, yeah.
But the Bible never said, and if you disagree with your brothers, go start your own church, right?
No,
The
exactly.
Bible never said that. Yeah.
No, right.
I guess just one last question for today, and I'm so glad we can continue this conversation.
Oh, great. I appreciate it.
Yeah, but becoming Catholic, has it changed the way that you think about music?
Oh, well, okay. So when I went to USC grad school, and even back doing 16th century counterpoint and also studying Liber Usualis. So I was studying how to read neumes and chants at Wheaton College. So
Incredible.
that was a very important book to me, and I love Gregorian chant. I just love the way it sounds. I love the church modes. So I've always really liked that because it it harkens back to an earlier time when composers were so immersed in the church that they couldn't imagine composing outside of that environment. So that's always been fascinating to me. When I got to USC grad school, there was an early music ensemble which had, early music legitimate instruments, the crumb horns and sackbuts and lutes and recorders and Renaissance flutes. And I was a flute player and recorder player, so I could get in and join all those ensembles and read old looking music and do the improvisation as much as you could. And there was also a Gregorian chant group that I got into, so I could sing along with these chants, and I just loved it. So that's always been a little underlying thing. It's a little bag of tricks I could always dip into whenever I felt like it. Even doing commercials, believe it or not.
That's awesome.
So when I got around to doing Halo in 1999, one of the guys on the team, I said, what kind of music do you think what emotions are we trying to evoke with the music? And he says, it just needs to make people feel epic, ancient, and mysterious. And I'm like, well, ancient. Okay, that's Gregorian chant. Done. I'm going to do Gregorian chant. And so the opening to Halo is, it's just this. I wrote the melody, but it's Dorian Gregorian chant. So fast forward many years, I'm known for this thing. Some people call it the gamers' national anthem, which is kind of funny. And I think that's actually really interesting that the gamers' national anthem and groups of boys go into echoey bathrooms and sing the Halo chant. And they go viral on videos, YouTube and TikTok and stuff. So I'm known for that. And once I started doing RCIA, I started kind of feeling like, wow, I've co-opted something that has meaning, and it has meaning to me, and it has meaning for these gamers. They actually like Gregorian chant. But I thought, I think I'm going to come back to this. And it turned out that a friend of mine who does a podcast needed some, music, and I was thinking about doing an a cappella requiem mass. So I wrote this Kyrie and produced it. That's once again in E Dorian, the same thing, and it harkens back. It's sort of like I want to redeem my using of Gregorian chant for purely, manipulative commercial means. And now I'm like, okay, all right, I'm gonna come back and see if I can actually write something that's liturgical. And the Kyrie for me means so much. It's such a simple thing. It's so chock full of meaning, and it's in everything, every mass. And it's the original Greek, which I think is also fascinating. So I wrote this Kyrie, and um, we'll go from there. I still have more work to do.
Great, and I look forward to talking more about the Kyrie. Maybe we can figure out a way to even listen to some of that and
Sure.
talk about it. So that would be great. Well, Marty, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to our next conversation. So please look those up, and we thank you for joining us. And tune back in for our next 3 sessions.
Thanks, Jared.